This is Adopting Identities, written by This Is Entertaining, read to you by Evening Ruby. Rating: Teen and Up Audiences. Categories: FXM. Gen. Chapter 3. Crunch. Crash. Spider-Man groaned, orange dust coating his poorly sewn spandex uniform as he laid winded in the hole of what was once a brick wall. He groaned again as he sat up, though the noise was more frustration than pain, as he realized the crunch had been the sound of his phone shattering. Again. Honestly, at this point, he'd have preferred if it was his rib cracked. Of course, what he'd prefer doesn't really matter, but he doesn't exactly have much time to dwell on that because Rhino is still there and coming straight at him. Spider-Man leapt into the air. His spidey sense screamed. Only the supremely helpful power of sticking to walls saving him from being squished like, well, a bug, when Rhino charges. As it is, he's able to use a barely there grip on an above fire escape to swing up onto the metal landing and gain the upper ground. "Come on, man," the masked vigilante complains as he perched on the thin rod of the railing. "That was right in the phone pocket. Unnecessary, if you ask me. Oh well," he continued as he jumped down to use the villain's chest as a springboard, knocking the man back several steps, but not enough to truly push him over. The arachnid danced backwards as he continued to speak, well aware that he didn't have nearly enough room to build up any significant momentum with his web swinging in a cramped alleyway. "At least I can say I dropped it or something. When the shock of Friday, I had to tell people I accidentally put it in the microwave. Then of course came the lecture of how, if I didn't stay out so late, I would know the difference between a cell phone and a Hot Pocket, which, first of all, rude, and second of all, I'm not actually convinced one has more nutritional value than the other." Rhino bellowed and charged at him, but Spider-Man simply sent a shot of webbing to the bottom of the fire escape and swung out of reach. "Whoa, sorry, I didn't know you were a Hot Pocket fan," Spider-Man called, climbing to the top of a tall apartment and jumping to land feet first on his opponent's face. Rhino collapses with a bellow, stunned for the precious few moments it takes for Spider-Man to begin covering the man in webbing. "Can we at least agree that lean pockets taste like dirt? Not that you really look like you take much care in eating lean, mind you. Hey, aren't rhinos supposed to be vegetarian? Actually, I read somewhere that—" The masked vigilante was cut off as a familiar droning of the police sirens began to sound. "You know, you're just gonna have to Google it or something. That's my cue to leave." Rhino snorted and struggled anew against the sticky webbing, but Spidey just smirked. He'd spent all week improving his webbing formula. Big, Gray, and Ugly didn't have a chance of breaking it before the police showed up. "See ya! Wouldn't want to be ya!" he called as he shot away to the nearest skyscraper. Though once he was there, he chose simply to run across the rest of the rooftops until he made it back to the library where he'd left his backpack. There, the masked hero collapsed to sit on the dirty rooftop, pulling off his mask to reveal the floppy brown hair and puppy dog eyes of a 15-year-old Peter Parker. The teen sighed tiredly as he fished his phone out of its hidden pocket, groaning as he saw the once whole screen was nothing more than a mess of broken glass. He'd just spent the last of his money on making the improved wet fluid, and Jolly Jonah only ever bought pictures of Spider-Man from him every other week or so. There was no way he could ask his foster parents for money, not when it was the third phone to break since he moved in half a month ago. He half-heartedly poked at the screen, hoping it could be salvaged in some way, but the glass was too shattered to do anything more than reveal the notifications on the screen. The boy squinted, for once longing for the glasses he no longer needed as he struggled to read the letters hidden in the cracked and jumbled glass. 8 unread texts, 11 voicemails, 4 missed calls from Miss Johnson, 3 missed calls from Mr. Johnson, 6 missed calls from Miss Clarence. "Of course," Peter sighed, allowing his head to flop back against the metal piping he was sitting against. He closed his eyes as a choking sadness and helplessness rose in his throat. Of course. If Miss Clarence was calling, that could only mean yet another family had gotten tired of him returning at all hours of night, bloodied and bruised, more often than not. He couldn't blame them. He did everything he could to avoid being at the houses, avoid sitting around the table and eating dinner like a real family, when it just felt so wrong, especially when he didn't have any family left. His first foster family had been the best about it, actually, supportive and firm, but not overly critical. He'd started taking less risks, trying to be back at decent hours more. Then Miss Clarence had popped in for a surprise visit after a particularly nasty run-in with the Sandman, and she'd yanked him and all the other kids out of the house before anyone could blink. Peter had gotten the poor family investigated. They'd even gotten their fostering license revoked, despite many loud protests from all the kids under their care. It wasn't until Peter showed up with the same injuries with 3 other families that they were given their license back. Now, of course, Miss Clarence had come to expect his disappearing acts and injuries, had started warning families about it before Peter moved in. The teen was fairly certain that the woman assumed he was in a gang, which he didn't particularly like, but there was no way he was telling her the truth, so he had to live with it. Still, he didn't have to guess the reason behind the missed calls. With a final sigh, the boy grabbed his backpack, quickly switched out of his uniform for some normal clothes, knowing well he wouldn't have time to return to his hero duties that night. He hefted his overstuffed backpack onto his back. If he stuck to the alleys, he could probably web-sling most of the way and walk the rest. He'd make it to the office in no less than 15 minutes. No reason to head home after all. After the 4th house, he'd started carrying everything that was truly his in his bag. If the foster families wanted him to keep anything they gave him, they could bring it themselves. He wasn't going back for an awkward conversation and "I'll miss yous" that nobody really meant. The secretary looked up as he entered, but Peter was such a familiar face that she says nothing as he walks past the familiar hallway, though she did crane her neck looking for the Johnsons that weren't there. Peter sighed as he opened the familiar door, looking at his feet meekly. "Hi, Miss Clarence. I just got your message and, The boy froze, the last confused syllable droning on as his wide eyes take in the small closet of an office full of people who couldn't actually be there. No matter how long he stared, the group that couldn't actually be there never got any smaller. 3 women, each seeming more imposing than the next, and 5 men were cramped awkwardly into the hard wooden chairs, none of whom belonged in a dumpy little office with its peeling walls hidden by childish scribbles and barely their fluorescent lighting. No, these people weren't really here. They couldn't be. Oh no, he finally cracked, hadn't he? The secret identity, the blows to the head, the lame puns. He finally just went crazy. He knew it was only a matter of time. "Peter," Miss Clarence's voice sounds, somewhat shakily. "Where are Cheryl and Chris?" Peter's eyes snap away from the crowd to the social worker, his shocked mind blank for a moment before he recognizes the names. "Oh, I was closer to here than their house when I got your call, and I figured I was just getting kicked, that it was just the usual," he stammered, loath to admit that he regularly got kicked out of homes in front of these people, even if there was no way such icons were actually here. "So I, just came straight here." He shook his backpack for emphasis, and the woman frowned, though he couldn't be sure if it was because he was already preparing to change homes, or because he was close to the office that was over 45 minutes away from his current foster home, alone, after the sun had already started going down. "Do they at least know you're here?" Well..." Peter looked to his shoes, and the woman sighed, her eyes straying to the group. Peter felt like he was filing a job interview or something. "As you can see, it's not exactly the usual, which we could have told you if you had answered your phone. she said pointedly. Oh, I kinda... I dropped it and... He pulled the shattered mess out of his pocket sheepishly, only to jump when one of the men who couldn't possibly actually be in this office suddenly stood and crossed the room to take it out of his hand. Not a problem. We'll get you a new one. Stark phone, of course. Top of the line. Maybe better. Hope you're not too attached to whatever plan you have, kid. Tony, the blond man sitting down says chastisingly, but the other simply looks at Peter expectantly. And Peter is so befuddled by this point, the only reply that comes to mind is, "It's a track phone." Tony. As in, Tony Stark. There is no denying now that Tony Stark is currently standing in his social worker's office holding his phone like it's personally insulted the man. Eyebrows shoot up. Really? I didn't know those still existed, or that people other than drug dealers used them. Peter opened his mouth to reply, probably something stupid that would incriminate him as a drug dealer, but before he could, he was saved by Miss Clarence clearing her throat. Obviously, Peter, I didn't call you in for the usual. Yeah. And of course, his voice would choose that exact moment to crack. Great. Just great. I bet this kind of stuff never happens to Captain America, he thinks, before having a mini meltdown as he realizes that Captain America is in the room. I'd hoped that Cheryl and Chris could have informed you about this before you got here. It wasn't until the words, what is this?" popped out of his mouth that a heavy weight of dread and realization lay in his stomach. Whatever this was, it couldn't be good. Not with his track record. As the social worker began to speak, at last all members of the Avengers turned to look at the woman. From the corner of his eye, Peter saw a flash of burgundy-red hair as Black Widow finally ceased her piercing assessment of him. The shock of color brought a heavy weight of dread in the young man's gut. The very night before, the selfsame shock of color had flashed as he took care of a group of men accosting a woman, the color accompanied by the slight tingling of spider sense. After he'd webbed up the men, the young hero had followed the sighting, intending to talk to whoever had been spying on him. However, the instant he caught up with the woman, she'd handed him his butt. He'd just barely managed to web her hand before she cast him away. Even then, she fiddled with her wrist and the webbing crumpled in a way that it usually only did when the shocker fried it. He'd had half a mind to follow the mystery woman that night, but by that point, he'd already been over half an hour past curfew and couldn't convince his throbbing muscles it was worth it. In the dark of the New York alleyway, he hadn't been able to recognize his observer, but here in the brightly lit beige office, he didn't have a single doubt it was Natasha Romanoff who had been watching him that night. His mouth dried, and his already fast heartbeat only quickened more as the implications of seeing the Black Widow the night before the Avengers visited his social worker kicked in. There was only one reason why the Avengers would bother cramming into this little office, and it wasn't to talk to Peter Parker, or at least, not the Peter Parker who didn't sling webs and take down muggers in his free time. They knew he was Spider-Man, and they were here to confront him about it. He knew it was only a matter of time. Each new stand with Spider-Man merchandise, which he never got a dime of by. He was gonna have to figure out if he could sue someone anonymously. Daredevil implied that he knew a lawyer, got him closer to being on the Avengers' radar. Now they had finally found him, and who knew what was going to happen to him or his alter ego now. Maybe actually listening would help. Adoption without first fostering is rare, but the Avengers obviously have more than adequate living arrangements. Also, despite some... Wait, adoption? Peter squeaked, looking at the group with wide eyes as his mind continued to whirl. Miss Clarence closed her eyes and let out a breath she probably hoped was subtle, but really wasn't. But before she could speak, the woman sitting closest to Tony answered. Yes, adoption. Peter, We, as the Avengers, are here to offer you a home with us. We would like to invite you to become a part of the Avengers family. If you accept, we already have a room waiting for you in the tower."
"Really?"
The boy gaped, his mind slowly working to fill in the gaps. If they were inviting him to the tower, then that means they were inviting Spider-Man to the Avengers. This was incredible. He replayed the moment the Avengers realized his identity over and over in his mind, outlaying every scenario and possibility. Sure, he'd thought about them inviting him on the team, dreamed of it, but it seemed like a distant dream that you dream while knowing it will never actually happen. Like the bench warmer, imagining going on court and making 10 points in a row, or the person buying a raffle ticket imagining they win the grand prize, or Flash dreaming of getting anything above a B- in anything, ever. Long story short, he never actually let himself hope to become a member of the Avengers, but here they are! More. They were speaking in code, with words like adoption, to preserve his secret identity. This was more than he could have dreamed of, and they were acting like this was something he had to think about, like there was any chance he would be stupid enough to say anything other than, "Yes!" Peter blurted out, cutting off Pepperpot's ongoing spiel. Yes, please, I would like to accept." He cleared his throat, feeling a red blush creep onto his cheek. I would love to be adopted by you." "Don't just give us the answer you think you need to," Natasha suddenly sounded. "This isn't something for you to take lightly. If you agree to this, you'll be putting yourself in a lot of danger." Right. He spent most of his time taking care of muggers. The people the Avengers faced would be a whole new ballgame. But he would be fighting with them, as a team. He wasn't worried. Much. One arm came to push back his shaggy hair and rub the back of his neck. I get that. You guys go around the world fighting aliens and killer robots and people trying to create biological weapons and stuff. But you're the Avengers. You're like the most powerful people on Earth. "It's more than being caught up in our saving the world drama," Falcon interjected. "We have a lot of enemies, more than we even know of. You're an obvious weakness. Once it gets out that you're with us, all of their sights will be on you." That kinda hurt. Sure, he didn't always get the bad guy, and he came home looking like he was put through the grinder most of the time, but still, he didn't think Spider-Man would be an obvious weakness. Although, he supposed it makes sense. The new guy would always be the weak spot for the team, and there was a lot of footage of him fighting that bad guys could examine. Still, he was stronger than he looked. He opened his mouth to argue when Captain America began. "We could train you the best we could to defend yourself, but even just agreeing to live with us immediately places you in a very, very dangerous situation." Peter felt his sinking heart begin to soar. Training. Yes, training would be amazing. No more breaking fingers because he threw a punch wrong. He would be learning actual fighting techniques. He might even be able to learn spy stuff if the look Black Widow was giving him was any indication. More than that, who knew what tricks Tony could teach him about technology? Maybe he could even get a suit that didn't come from Joanne's discount spandex barn. This was incredible. He was so ready to become an Avenger. He could handle whatever villains came their way. He was no lightweight himself. He'd taken care of some pretty significant baddies. He could do this if they just gave him a chance. Of course, he couldn't say that. Not when Miss Clarence was still sitting at her desk, nearly hyperventilating. "I get that. I really do, I promise. But there's a lot I regret not doing. Like not stopping that thief, or walking with Aunt May, or the list goes on and on. I know that if I don't do this, it'll just end up being another regret. Another what if. I don't want that." Silence reigned in the room once more as Captain America caught and held the boy's gaze. For a moment, the look held, determination and unwavering, until finally the super soldier spoke. "Okay then, welcome to the family."